We're joined by Peter Cardillo. He's Chief Market Economist at Spartan Capital Securities. Peter, good morning. Thanks much, or rather, good evening to you. Thanks much for joining in all the way from New York. What did you make of the testimony and the fact that almost in the early half itself, when it came... Okay, let me first ask you what did you make of the testimony?
Well, there's no question that, it seems that Fed Powell has made a big change here in the sense that he stressed that risks, and he used that word quite often yesterday. And as a result of that, he hinted that the Fed is getting ready to lower rates. Now, whether or not it's the right call, I guess it's too early to tell. And he's basically basing it on weakness of the global economy, which obviously would eventually impact the U.S. economy. So I think the bottom line here is that he's taking an insurance policy, and whether or not that's going to be positive or negative, we just have to wait and see.
Now, yeah, I mean, whether or not it's the right call, I think time will tell. But Peter, the one small interesting thing that I thought in my assessment was how quickly Jerome Powell moved from citing the globe as one key reason for the statements that he made, because the U.S. was looking, or arguably is looking, a lot stronger than before. So he invoked the global market and the pressures and the pulls there when talking about the decision or the outlook that he gave out yesterday.
Yes, in fact, you might say there are cross currents. There's no question about that. We've seen that in the macro data as of recently. But again, he continued to mention the strong labor market, and that strong labor market, if it continues to persist, as we saw in last week's number, obviously at one point or another, we're going to see higher wages. True that most of the jobs that have been created are low-paying jobs, and so from that perspective, inflation remains at bay. But nevertheless, there are certain indicators that remain strong, while, of course, others are being impacted by the trade war that, by the way, seems to be expanding.
Yeah, which is true. So therefore, my question, Peter, is that did you get a sense, I mean, irrespective of whether there is, more than one in this calendar year, and how steep and how soon can it happen is one question. The point is, while the market, for example, when the jobs report came out on Friday, the market suddenly started believing that, what if the Fed doesn't do the action? My question is, almost repeatedly now, in the last 3 or 4 or 5 instances that the Fed has spoken, more often than not, they've sounded like being a lot more accommodative to the financial market pressures when they take the rate decision. Should the market stop bothering about the economic data when it comes out very strong and say that, what if the Fed doesn't do anything at all? Because the Fed seems to be very accommodative at the current point of time.
Yes, well, I think, you might say that maybe that while Mr. Powell has basically said over and over that he's keeping his independence, that maybe he's caving in to pressures from the administration to lower rates. And obviously the argument from the administration is that lower rates would be more helpful to combat the trade war. And obviously, it would give them more wiggling room and keep the economy from faltering. But again, we just have to wait and see. But there is one point that I think that should be noted, and that is that he went out of his way to distance himself in terms of the gold standard. And he also explained why he didn't think that would be appropriate, making a case going back to the early 1930s, and of course then pointing out what Nixon did in the 1970s. And so I think basically this is a way of responding back to the administration. But nonetheless, it does appear that he may have weakened his position, and that weakness comes from pressure from the administration.
Yeah, well, maybe there will be some pulls and pressures that he's facing from the administration that we obviously don't know and will never know about as well. Let's see how he reacts to those too. Peter, thanks so much for taking the time out and speaking to us.